Welcome to Mr. Night Media.
In 1990, the Thompsons had recently moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania, excited to settle into their new life. Halloween arrived just a month after they unpacked the last box, and the family decided to fully embrace the festive spirit by decorating their home with fake spider webs, carved pumpkins, and eerie lights. For Beth Thompson, Halloween had always been her favorite holiday. She'd made sure her kids had the perfect costumes, prepared special treats, and even had a spooky playlist softly playing by the doorway as they handed out candy. As evening fell, the neighborhood transformed into a parade of costumes, laughter, and candy bags. The night was brisk, the air filled with that distinct scent of fallen leaves and the sound of children giggling as they dashed from house to house. The Thompsons' porch light remained on as a sign for trick-or-treaters, and the family cheerfully handed out candy for hours. Around 10 p.m., the trick-or-treaters dwindled. Most children were tucked in bed by then, their sugar highs fading. Just as Beth started to turn off the porch light, she spotted a lone figure slowly approaching her house from down the sidewalk. She squinted, trying to make out who it could be, thinking it might be one last late-night candy hunter. As the figure drew closer, Beth felt a peculiar chill run down her spine. The boy looked to be about 10 years old, wearing a vintage clown costume. Unlike the colorful costumes most kids wore, his was faded and dull, like it had been through too many Halloweens. It seemed almost tired. His face was painted white with smudges that seemed more like shadows than makeup, and he wore a wide red grin that looked cracked and unnatural. But his eyes were what truly unnerved her. They were hollow, dark, and unblinking, as though they didn't quite belong to him. He stopped on the porch, looking up at her with those unsettling eyes. Beth hesitated, but old habits took over, and she reached into the candy bowl, offering him a handful. The boy didn't move to take the candy. Instead, he looked straight at her, leaning forward slightly, and whispered in a voice barely louder than a breath, "You took her from me." Beth's hand froze midair. A cold wave of fear swept over her. She stumbled for words, her voice barely audible. Who are you talking about?" But the boy turned, walking back down the steps and vanishing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. Beth's heart pounded as she closed the door, locking it tight behind her. She felt an uneasy heaviness settle in the house, and as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the image of his hollow eyes and the strange words he had whispered. The next morning, Beth shared the experience with her husband, who brushed it off as just a strange kid playing a Halloween prank. But Beth felt there was something more, something deeply unsettling. Over the next few days, she tried to let the incident go, but the boy's eerie face haunted her thoughts. Curiosity eventually got the best of her, and she decided to ask the elderly neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, about the previous owners of her house. Mrs. Wilson had lived in the neighborhood for decades and knew its history well. When Beth asked about the family who'd lived in their home before, Mrs. Wilson grew quiet, her expression darkening. "There was a family, the Johnsons," Mrs. Wilson began, her voice soft and hesitant. "They lived there about 20 years ago, nice people. They had a little boy, Thomas. Poor boy met a tragic end on Halloween night." Beth's heart raced. She could already sense where the story was going, but she needed to hear it all. "He was dressed as a clown that night," Mrs. Wilson continued. "Just like every Halloween before, he loved clowns. But something happened. He and his little sister went trick-or-treating, but at some point he wandered off. They found him the next morning down by the lake. He'd drowned. His poor mother was devastated, and the family moved away shortly after." The revelation made Beth's skin crawl. She felt a chill that settled deep within her, as if her bones were turning to ice. She stammered, trying to gather her thoughts. Did Thomas's mother ever think something strange was happening?" Mrs. Wilson's face grew serious, and her voice took on a hushed tone. There were whispers. His mother claimed to have seen Thomas in their home after he'd passed. Neighbors brushed it off as grief, of course, but she swore that he was there, waiting for her, for his sister. That's why they left. She believed Thomas was tied to the house, lingering because he didn't understand what had happened. Beth barely slept that night, her mind replaying Mrs. Wilson's words. The story, combined with the memory of that boy's hollow eyes and chilling whisper, made her feel as if a ghost was sharing her home. The following Halloween, Beth couldn't bring herself to turn on the porch light. She sat in the dark, her heart thumping with fear at every sound outside. Around 10 p.m., she thought she heard soft footsteps on the porch, followed by a faint, familiar whisper, "You took her from me." Beth's blood ran cold, and she clutched her husband's arm as they sat in silence, listening to the ghostly voice that seemed to drift away into the night. It was the fall of 2005, and a crisp October chill hung in the air as a group of friends in rural Indiana excitedly made their way to the annual haunted hayride. The hayride was a well-loved Halloween event, known for its creepy actors and eerie atmosphere. Everyone in town had heard of it, and each year, the organizers seemed to outdo themselves with new frights and themes. This year, the hayride was rumored to be scarier than ever, complete with fog machines, atmospheric lighting, and a new cast of ghoulish actors ready to leap out from the shadows. The group of friends, 6 in total, had been looking forward to this night for weeks. They piled into the tractor-drawn hayride, laughing and shivering in anticipation. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay, and dim lights strung along the route cast long shadows on the surrounding trees. The tractor's engine rumbled to life, and they began their journey along the dark trail, their excitement blending with a sense of trepidation. As they ventured deeper into the woods, eerie sound effects filled the air. Ghostly wails, rattling chains, and the occasional blood-curdling scream. Figures in tattered costumes wandered along the trail, their faces obscured by makeup and masks, appearing to stumble aimlessly before suddenly lunging toward the hayride. The friends screamed and laughed, clinging to each other as the ghosts and zombies made their rounds. The scares were intense but playful, a perfect mix for a Halloween adventure. As they neared the end of the route, the tractor slowed to a crawl, and they entered a part of the trail that was noticeably darker and quieter than the rest. Thick fog clung to the ground, and the sounds of the other attractions faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The friends huddled closer, the playful atmosphere replaced by a nervous tension. Just then, a figure appeared out of the fog, a young woman dressed in an old-fashioned, tattered white dress with long, stringy hair that covered much of her face. Unlike the other actors, this woman's appearance was unsettling in a different way. Her dress looked aged, with stains and tears as if it had been buried in the ground for years. Her movements were slow and deliberate, and her skin had a strange pallid tone. Thinking it was part of the show, one of the girls, Emily, nudged her friend, whispering, "That one's really creepy. She's good." The woman moved toward the back of the hayride, her bare feet silent against the ground, and climbed onto the wagon. She settled herself directly behind Emily, close enough that Emily could feel a chill radiating from her. Thinking this was a new, interactive scare tactic, Emily and her friends laughed nervously, trying to talk to the woman, asking her name and joking that she was the scariest part of the ride. But the woman remained silent, her head tilted slightly downward, her hair obscuring her face. As they continued along the trail, Emily could feel the woman's icy presence behind her. It was different from the warmth and energy of the other actors, who had been loud and playful. This woman's silence was unnerving, and every so often Emily swore she could hear faint whispers, like the rustling of leaves, but strangely close to her ear. She turned around a few times to get a better look at the woman, but the way the figure sat, hunched and unmoving, made her uneasy. Finally, the hayride reached its end. The friends were relieved to be back in the safety of the bustling entrance area, where families and children milled about, laughing and eating caramel apples. They hopped off the wagon, chatting about the ride and the creepy woman who'd joined them. Emily turned back, expecting to see the woman still sitting on the hayride, but to her surprise, the spot was empty. She looked around, confused. "Where did she go?" she asked, glancing at her friends, who all looked equally puzzled. The ride operator noticed their confusion and asked if everything was all right. Emily explained that a woman in a long dress had climbed onto the back of the hayride, describing her in detail. The operator's face grew pale, and he quickly shook his head. "There's no one like that on the staff tonight," he replied. "No one should have been on the ride with you." Thinking he was joking, they pressed him, but he grew increasingly adamant, insisting that no actors were allowed to ride the hay wagon itself, and none of their cast matched her description. Uneasy, the group left the haunted hayride and tried to laugh it off, but a lingering chill remained as they recounted the woman's strange, silent presence. Later that night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woman's cold, empty eyes and tattered dress haunted her thoughts, and she decided to search for any stories about the hayride's location. After some digging, she found a chilling bit of history. The land where the hayride now operated had been the site of a tragedy in the 1920s. A barn on the property had once belonged to a young woman named Eleanor, who had lost her family in a fire that consumed the barn one October night. Witnesses had claimed to see Eleanor running into the flames, screaming for her family, and she'd never been seen again. In the years since, rumors circulated that her ghost wandered the grounds, forever searching for her loved ones. Emily's blood ran cold as she read about the woman's ghostly sightings, the same description repeating in each account. A young woman in a long white dress, with stringy hair and hollow eyes, forever lost in the fog. Halloween night in 1974 started like any other for the O'Brien family in Deer Park, Texas. The air was thick with excitement as children dressed in costumes flooded the streets, eagerly knocking on doors and calling, "Trick or treat!" 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien was no different. He was thrilled to be out collecting candy with his sister, Elizabeth, and their friends. His father, Ronald Clark O'Brien, joined them on the chilly evening, shepherding the children from house to house as they gathered their sugary loot. Timothy's costume that year was simple, but enough to thrill him as he and the others moved door to door, filling their bags with candy. Toward the end of the night, they stopped at a house with no porch lights on, which usually signaled that the homeowners weren't giving out treats. But Ronald knocked on the door anyway. After a few moments, the door cracked open, and a hand slipped out, offering 5 large pixie sticks to Ronald. Ronald beamed, showing them to the children. The sugary tubes, filled with flavored powder, were a rare treat, much larger and more enticing than the average candy bars they'd collected. As the night wound down, the kids ran through their piles of candy at home, comparing their hauls. Timothy was particularly excited about his pixie sticks and eagerly tore it open. After tasting it, he made a face, complaining to his dad that it tasted bitter. Ronald handed him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash it down, reassuring him that it was just the candy's flavor. Within minutes, Timothy began to feel sick. His stomach churned violently, and he started vomiting. His parents rushed to his side, terrified by the intensity of his symptoms. As his condition worsened, they raced him to the hospital, but it was too late. Despite the doctor's efforts, Timothy died shortly after arriving. The sudden, unexplained death of an 8-year-old boy on Halloween night sent shockwaves through the community. Parents across Deer Park were gripped with terror, wondering if someone had tampered with the candy given to their children. Rumors quickly spread, and parents began frantically sorting through their kids' treats, throwing away anything remotely suspicious. The hospital staff, suspecting foul play due to the boy's unusual symptoms, contacted the authorities. Preliminary tests confirmed their fears. The pixie sticks Timothy had eaten contained cyanide, a lethal poison with an almond-like smell that was immediately detectable once they analyzed the powder. Investigators realized they were dealing with an unimaginable act of malice. They had to determine how the poison had ended up in Timothy's candy and whether any other children were in danger. When Ronald O'Brien was questioned, he described how he'd gotten the pixie sticks from a darkened house while trick-or-treating. He claimed he didn't see the face of the person who handed them over, only a shadowy hand that had reached through the door. But as police scoured the neighborhood, interviewing residents and retracing the family's route, no one recalled giving out pixie sticks that night, nor had anyone seen a person matching the description Ronald gave. As the investigation continued, inconsistencies in Ronald's story began to emerge. Detectives found it suspicious that, despite his apparent insistence that the candy had come from a stranger, only his own children and 3 others received the tainted pixie sticks, and none of the other children had consumed theirs. When they finally located the other pixie sticks, they were horrified to discover that each one had been cut open and resealed with cyanide powder inside. The police dug deeper into Ronald O'Brien's life, uncovering a troubling financial situation. He was deeply in debt, his car was about to be repossessed, and he faced several overdue bills he couldn't pay. He'd also taken out life insurance policies on both his children, policies he'd increased just days before Halloween. With mounting evidence, a grim picture began to emerge. Ronald had plotted to murder his own son for the insurance money, disguising it as a random Halloween poisoning to deflect suspicion. The details of Ronald's plan were chilling. Investigators learned that he had been inquiring about cyanide at chemical companies and asking colleagues about the amount required to kill a person. They also discovered that he had given the tainted pixie sticks to other children as part of his plot, hoping that spreading the poison would make Timothy's death look like part of a larger tragedy rather than a targeted act. But his plan unraveled when none of the other children ate the poisoned candy. On November 5, 1974, Ronald O'Brien was arrested and charged with murder. During his trial, the prosecutor painted a disturbing portrait of a father willing to commit the ultimate betrayal, not only ending his son's life but attempting to poison other children in his community. The case shocked the nation, becoming one of the most infamous crimes in Texas history. The press dubbed him the Candyman, a moniker that would haunt him as his trial continued. Ronald O'Brien's defense argued that he was innocent, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about his financial troubles, his discussions about cyanide, and his unusual behavior on Halloween night. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death, and years later, he was executed by lethal injection, taking with him the horrifying legacy of a father who sacrificed his son for financial gain. Timothy O'Brien's tragic death left a permanent scar on Halloween traditions. The incident instilled a deep-rooted fear among parents about the safety of their children's Halloween candy. Since then, Halloween has never been the same, with parents everywhere meticulously inspecting their children's treats, haunted by the thought that a seemingly innocent candy could hide something sinister.